Hello, I'm Lucas. This is Strike the Sun MD, and I would like to talk about 1984. This mostly will be a video about my reading response the first time, back when I was a teenager, and how I felt about it this time and what I noticed. So it won't be too much of a review. I think you should read it. It's a good book. There are flaws with it. But it's the kind of book. I'll give a brief rundown. Winston Smith is the man that we follow. He works for the Department of Records in the Ministry of Truth, which is a propaganda outlet for the government, Ingsoc for the country, Oceania, led by the patriarch Big Brother. And the Ministry of Truth, he works for the Records Department, and he's constantly revising history so that it suits the needs of the party, because the Ministry of Truth is not about truth. It deals in lies. It changes and revises and changes and revises history again and again, so that Big Brother can never be in the wrong, and so that Big Brother can be at the head of all great inventions and historical moments. There, of course, are other ministries, the Ministry of Peace, which concerns itself with war, with Eurasia. And there's the Ministry of Plenty, which deals with rationing out supplies and food, and the numbers are constantly fudged if they could ever exist in the first place. Because every part of this government, this totalitarian government, its direct purpose is to oppress people so thoroughly that they have no other thoughts than for the support of Big Brother and the government. And it exerts power to beget power to beget power, because that is all they're interested in. And it's horribly dehumanizing in a number of ways. And the book in general will absolutely gut you, because the way it's structured, you follow Winston Smith as he starts having these thought crimes. He can no longer accept what the party wants him to not only accept, but to believe and to know. A recurring theme is 2 + 2 = 5. He knows 2 + 2 = 4, mathematically, of course. With simple arithmetic, you can figure that out. But if the party says 2 + 2 = 5, then he must know and internalize that 2 + 2 = 5 in this sort of doublethink way of going about the world, which is why the Ministry of Peace deals with war, and the Ministry of Plenty deals with meager rations, if any at all, and the Ministry of Truth spreads propaganda that it revises the next day, because there are inconsistencies with what the party needs now compared to yesterday. You root for him. You want him to find a way to get out of this situation or to effect change in some way. And he comes along to people that he feels he can trust. Julia, who is the biggest rebel of them all, especially below the waist, we'll say, with plenty of people who have been vaporized, which is what happens when thought criminals are caught. And of course, there's O'Brien, a member of the inner party. which comprises about 2% of the population. Julia and Winston are part of the outer party, which is about 13%. And then there's the proles. And Winston has great faith in the power of the proles because there's so many of them. They're about 85% of the population. And you want him to find a way to be part of the Brotherhood, which is a secret organization that's hinted at, led by Goldstein, who has written a book that describes how the government operates. But that's not what Winston is concerned with. He understands how. He wants to know why. He can't quite put his finger on it. But as I mentioned, as the way it's structured, you want him to find a way to get the proles in action, to get the Brotherhood, to get things going. But if you've ever read the book, you know that it just can't be. He has no hope. We see him at the beginning of this novel in April, and we think that's when he started to have his own thoughts and started writing in his journal, which is very suspicious and worthy of thought crime itself, especially considering the fact that he is saying down with Big Brother in it, which the party does not approve of, because that is not what the party wants. The party has been following his case for 7 years. Well before the beginning of this novel, when we are first introduced to Winston. We don't find that out till much later. And all hope is lost. And you just feel hurt and sorrow, and you want to help the guy, but there's nothing to do. And it sort of feels like there's no escape. And in a way, for Winston, certainly there is not. And when I first read it, the moment that Winston and Julia are caught in their criminal passion, and Winston says, before they realize they're caught, "We are the dead." And Julia, "We are the dead." And from behind a wall, behind a painting on a telescreen, someone, a thought police, says, "You are the dead." At that point, you know it's over. And when I read it as a teenager, I threw the book away and I said, "No!" I was in such shock, such a state of trauma and horror, because up to that point I believed that things were gonna work out. And this was the first book to really instill the idea into me that things don't always work out. No matter how hard you try, no matter how much you want it. There are forces at hand that you cannot control. I couldn't read the book for a few days because I just was in so much pain about this. But I finished. And it only gets worse. It really only gets worse. Julia and Winston believe that while they may be caught and killed, they cannot conform to Big Brother, which I believe is the thing they fear the most. But then they're brought to room 101. And they feel that the only way that Big Brother can possibly win over them is if, essentially, that they betray each other. And how can they betray each other? By not loving another person more than themselves. And that's what Big Brother does. That's what Ingsoc does. They break down Julia and they break down Winston. And they make them betray each other so that they can not create a martyr when they're eventually killed. They want these people who are thought criminals to confess to all these crimes, and not just confess so that the torture will end, but know that they are in the wrong and know that they should be punished, and to love Big Brother in their heart more than anyone else, more than they loved each other. And when I finished reading the book as a teenager, and I read the final passage of Winston, I was so depressed. I was really depressed. I just couldn't believe it. It really rocked me. And, you know, as a teenager, I was not very thoughtful, perhaps. I did not pay attention much to what happened around the world. I just felt like, oh yeah, things are gonna be okay. Things will always work out. And luckily for me, things have always worked out, but it was that moment that things started to click, and I started to notice that, oh wait, the world is not a great place. And, you know, sure, there's all kinds of parallels you could make with the novel, but this book sort of set me off on a political, emotional journey, and for that I will always be grateful, and I will always cherish this book. Now that I've read it in my 20s, there is a part of the book I never read before, and that's the appendix. And what the appendix is, it's referenced in the very early chapter of the first part. I think it's on page 6, if I remember right. Like chapter 1, part 1. When Newspeak, the official language of Ingsoc, is introduced, which is an invention of the party to reduce the language down to its bare minimum so that thought crime becomes even harder and almost an impossibility, if not completely impossible. And this appendix, it lays out everything about not thought crime, about Newspeak and how it works and why it was invented and when it was supposed to roll out and be officially the official language and the standard language to be used. And it talks about Newspeak in the past tense. As if Newspeak doesn't exist anymore, except in documents that have lasted, which would mean that this book is sort of like a biography, I suppose, and the appendix goes on to explain more about the world in an academic way. It's more emotional within the novel itself. But that would mean that Ingsoc fell at some point, and perhaps the proles did succeed in their overtaking of the government and bringing things back into order, as opposed to the bleak, vacuous wasteland that is Oceania in this time in 1984. So when I read it the first time, I didn't understand why they spent 7 years to take him down when I thought, oh, they noticed him, why didn't they just get him right away? This time I realize, wait a second, they probably follow people for a while before they realize that's something that we can take away from him. That's how we can manipulate this person into accepting our ideology before we kill them, so that they're not a martyr, and so that we don't get an uprising of more thought criminals. Because he has Julia, and before that, he had a wife that he hated that was taken away. I believe she's gone for 11 years, if I remember right. But they didn't have leverage over him until they had Julia. And when they bring him to room 101 to show him the thing he fears the most, I think the thing he fears the most is conforming to Big Brother, not so much, in this case, it's rats for him. I don't doubt that in a physical sense, his biggest fear is rats, because of the disease or disgust or just, whatever. But I think his real biggest fear is conforming to Big Brother and accepting and being just like all the other idiots, so to speak. And that's how they get these people. They wait until they have leverage over them. In this case, Julia had Winston. Winston had Julia. And they get him then, so that they can maximize the pain and maximize the force exerted on them, and use that as a pressure point to get them to submit wholeheartedly and accept and know Big Brother and love Big Brother. But even though they have that ability, they still come crashing down, is my assumption. I used to read this as utterly bleak and horrible and as a warning of what could be, given that it was written shortly after World War II. And certainly George Orwell had seen some horrifying governments come to power in his time. And I thought back then, okay, he's taking those ideas to an extreme. And I do think now he's taking to an extreme, but I don't see it so much as a warning. Not to say it's not a warning, but I see it as a book of triumph, of humanity's ability to overcome this sort of evil, if that makes sense. Now, I could be wrong, let me know what you think, but I think it's more of a hopeful book. I mean, it's his last book. I don't actually know what he thought about the book. I love it. I recommend you read it. Tell me what you think. If you have read it, consider rereading it yourself if you haven't read it in a while. Winston, another thing I meant to say before I kind of got on another tangent was that even the Brotherhood, we're not sure if it exists. We barely know if the war exists. I mean, it definitely did, I think. The war with East Asia. Which of y'all remember I said they're at war with Eurasia? Or did I? No, they must have been at war with East Asia. Nope, they're at war with Eurasia. They've always been at war with Eurasia. They're at war with East Asia. They've always been at war with East Asia. I don't know what I'm saying. The point is, Goldstein is a fabrication. It is yet another way to oppress people that are thought criminals. They think they have this enemy to look forward to, and I always thought, yeah, that's so confusing. This time, I think Goldstein is a fabrication, which means he's not real, which made it feel even worse that there's not even a real movement, possibly. There's no sort of intellectual mind or philosophical mind or whatever that is actually opposed to it, that is this sort of guy that's real, for example, real at all in any sense, because he's a fabrication of the party. But I don't remember what I was going to say now. I just lost it. Goldstein's fabrication of the party. Where I think the flaws of the government, where I think things fall apart, I don't exactly know how it happens, because he doesn't give answers to how it will happen. He does point a finger at, look, here's a problem. Let's see where it can go. But I still have faith, you know. The way I see this thing crumbling apart is because they spend an enormous amount of manpower revising and editing and changing everything, and having pointless wars and things that are just for show, and revising and editing all that stuff too. And they just spend so much manpower to keep anything devoid of any meaning. And even the enemies are fake and fictionalized. But I think that's intentional, to show the cracks, so to speak, where things could get out, if they eventually do and when they should. There's no answer for how. But I feel, I'm going on forever about this point. Basically, we are the proles, and the power lies within you to effect change. And just to talk about some of the things that I think are kind of weak, every sort of different part of the text, the appendix, the novel itself, and the Goldstein book, they all do have that George Orwell voice. So it sort of makes me think, is 1984 supposed to be the Goldstein book, so they did win, which negates my prior hopeful meaning? I guess possibly, but that's sort of thinking of it too metatextually and in a too far gone academic sense. And there are also like times where there's mischosen words and the sentence structure is not very... I think he's a great writer, prose-wise, but sometimes he can say things that are just... And there's a few plot devices that are just dry, like Syme. He reintroduces Newspeak when we've already had the appendix explain it to us, but he's supposed to be like someone that we hate, and he has no other characteristic other than later he'll be vaporized. But yeah, point being, you should read it. The proles, us, we can affect change, and I think it's a hopeful book. And if it's not, well, then teenage me was right, and the world is a depressing place. But I'm happy I read it. I'm happy I can read. I'm happy I don't live quite in a world like 1984, and although there are parallels, I thank you for watching. Please tell me what you think. Goodbye.